The United Nations Climate Summit COP27 has ended with a landmark deal for developing countries. But there's been disappointment that there was no commitment to further cuts in greenhouse gases. Negotiators in Egypt agreed to set up a fund to help poorer nations deal with damage caused by climate change, like flooding. The UN chief Antonio Guterres said it was an important step towards justice. But there has been criticism that there were no new pledges to cut emissions. Here's our climate editor, Justin Rolat.
These talks were supposed to end on Friday. They went through Friday night and then through Saturday night. It was 4:15 on Sunday morning when the gavel finally came down on the loss and damage deal.
I hear no objections, it's so decided.
The exhausted delegates only managed a ripple of applause, but this is a landmark deal on an issue that has dogged these talks for decades.
Clearly, this will not be enough, but it is a much-needed political signal to rebuild broken trust. The voices of those on the front lines of the climate crisis must be heard.
Hurricane Ian tears through Cuba earlier this year. Today's deal creates a fund to help vulnerable nations cope with the loss and damage climate-related storms, droughts and floods are already wreaking in their communities.
The deal on loss and damage is undoubtedly a breakthrough, but there is huge disappointment in this room. Disappointment that the rest of the text is not more ambitious.
Leaders of delegations met to discuss how they could change the wording to increase the effort to cut emissions. The aim of these summits is to raise ambition every year, but today's deal dials back on what was agreed last year in Glasgow. We need to switch to renewable power, it says, but also low-emission energy.
What is low-emission energy?
It is understood the phrase was included after pressure from the Saudi delegation and other fossil fuel-rich countries, and it is feared it could allow natural gas to be classified as green.
There was a very strong move by some of the petro-states to try and unwind some of those decisions and in fact go back to pre-Paris kind of arrangements. And so, I mean, as you can tell, because how late we are, it was sort of trench warfare on that.
Many nations wanted the targets for emission reductions to be much stronger.
Emissions peaking before 2025, as the science tells us, is necessary. Not in this text. Clear follow-through on the phase down of coal. Not in this text. A clear commitment to phase out all fossil fuels. Not in this text. And the energy text weakened in the final minutes.
But the deal on loss and damage is genuinely a breakthrough, says the woman who led negotiations for developing countries.
It's given me hope. It's restored faith in multilateralism. It's given us all hope in the COP system and literally in the power of working together.
The problem is, for many here, the rest of the deal is so disappointing. It means what could have been a triumph for Egypt is likely to end up being judged a failure. Justin Rolat, BBC News, Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt.
Well, let's now put some of the key topics from the COP summit into context. Climate finance was one of the central discussion points. Over a decade ago, richer countries agreed to provide $100 billion a year to developing nations to reduce emissions by the end of 2020. This graph shows the progress being made, with the target now expected to be reached only in 2023. But developing nations have been calling for much more, and they want additional payments for loss and damage. That's for the impacts faced now. And today it was announced that a fund would be created for that. There was also a recommitment at COP for nations to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's compared to pre-industrial levels. But that pledge didn't go further than last year. And as you can see very clearly, the world is getting warmer. And there's a 55% chance that the world will go over the marker of 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years. And fossil fuels and gases which warm the planet were also on the agenda, with no commitments made to further reduce their use. Larger developing economies such as India and China have so far been reluctant to agree to phase out the most polluting fossil fuels. And you can see here that China is way out in front as the main emitter of carbon dioxide and is now responsible for more than a quarter of the world's overall greenhouse gas emissions. Well, our environment correspondent Matt McGrath has just returned from the summit and he joins us now from BBC's climate team headquarters in Cardiff. And Matt, how would you assess the achievements of COP27?
I would say on the question of loss and damage, Rita, it's a very significant day indeed. That's been 30 years in the making. Up to now, climate finance has been all about solar panels and seawalls. No money was being spent on storms, on floods like we saw in Pakistan earlier this year. That is now going to change, and that's a major victory for developing countries. Now, for the EU, the UK and many others who had rowed in behind this fund, they had hoped that other countries would support their idea of phasing out all fossil fuels. But as Justin has been reporting, that is not going to happen. And that is seen as a major blow for those countries. So that is seen as rowing back on the commitments made in Glasgow just last year. So it's been a good day for loss and damage, not such a good day for efforts to cut back on carbon.
OK, so the summit has come to an end. What happens now?
The negotiators will go back to their countries and they'll try and persuade their governments to focus on climate change. But with energy crisis, food crisis, cost of living crisis, that is going to be very difficult. But the science is really urgent. Emissions need to be halved this decade to really stave off the worst impacts of climate change. And what observers say what happened in Egypt wasn't good enough. It was a wasted year, if you like, in this critical decade. Now, the COP will meet again next year in Abu Dhabi, or in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, which is a leading oil and gas producer. Observers are concerned that getting fossil fuel phased out in that country will be very, very difficult as well.
So more on the Global Climate Summit, which begins next week. There are concerns that governments will reject more drastic measures to cut carbon emissions. One place where geopolitical turmoil is already having an impact on the climate fight is Svalbard in the Arctic Circle. The Norwegian archipelago is warming quicker than any other place on Earth. Our Europe correspondent Nick Beak went there to find out more.
Venture deep into the Arctic Circle and you find Svalbard. There's no place quite like it. And here, a struggle for survival. Climate change is on fast forward. Polar explorer Hilda Farmström wants to show us how her world is disappearing. Soon, an incredible sight, but one framed with sadness.
To survive as a polar bear now, I think you have to be super good at hunting, because the main source of food, the seals, they are diminishing, and the ice that both the seal and the polar bears are dependent on are diminishing. It's getting less and less ice.
This Norwegian archipelago is warming 6 times faster than the global average. There's much less ice here to reflect heat and more exposed ocean to absorb it.
These beluga whales, they're swimming in water that's much hotter than it used to be. And all wildlife here in Svalbard is having to adapt to this hotter world. You can hear them now. It's hotter in the water and it's hotter in the air too.
Melting here raises sea levels and affects weather patterns across the globe. In what is the northernmost settlement in the world, it's life on the edge. Houses are being moved and rebuilt, new barriers installed to stop more avalanches triggered by the thawing ground.
Wherever I look around us, I see change.
And leading polar scientist Kim Holloman tells us the war in Ukraine is now undermining the effort to understand climate change.
The official exchange with Russian institutions is not possible at this time. Half of the Arctic is Russian coastline. And if we are unable to share knowledge and data, it will hamper our ability to understand what is happening. It will. We need each other in order to do good science.
Svalbard attracts tens of thousands of visitors every year, putting further strain on this fragile environment. But the authorities claim they're moving towards renewable energy.
Now we are in one of the two production sites we have here in mine number 7. We are 8 kilometers in the mine.
This is Svalbard and Norway's last coal mine, which we're told is due to close.
It makes me sad. It was a mining town, and now it's coming to an end. It's more and more of a tourist town.
But just a fortnight after our visit, the state-owned company announces it's delaying the closure. Why? It says Europe's energy crisis now makes the mine a more profitable operation. If they can't give up fossil fuels in the fastest warming place on Earth, what hope for the rest? The UN says we face a climate emergency. The alarm is sounding. We ignore it at our peril. Nick Beake, BBC News, in the Arctic Circle.